Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Professor Davarian Baldwin, who is the Paul E. Raether Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College and has long been regarded as one of the best dressed and most stylish academics in the field. Baldwin is the author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, the Great Migration, and Black Urban Life, which is published by UNC 2007, and the co-editor with Minka Makalani of the essay collection Escape from New York, the New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem, which was published by University of Minnesota in 2013. And we are talking to him today about his latest book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, and that's bold type books. Of this new book, Ibram X. Kendi, who everyone would love to have a blurb from, describes the book as insightful, compelling, and timely. The book lays the groundwork for the role of universities in creating equitable and just cities. My own relationship with Professor Baldwin's work goes back to his groundbreaking essay, Black Empires, White and White Desires, The Spatial Politics of Identity in the Age of Hip Hop, which was published by Black Renaissance in 1999, and which we have republished now in 2 editions of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader. How you doing, Davarian? Long time.
Man, I'm good. You're taking me back. And I actually was going to start by saying thank you for creating the space for both, all scholars, but particularly scholars of color, young and now old. That was over 20 years ago. I was a lowly graduate student, and you plucked me up out of the abyss and said, "Yo, young brother, we like what you're doing. Come roll with us." And so I just want to say that you've been doing that for over 20 years. That's always been your way, whether it be in print or digital or televisual. You always had that ethos, that spirit. So I just want to thank you on behalf of all the people that have been benefited by your platform making ethos. So we thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that, Davarian. This new book, and I know you have been thinking about and through this new book for some time. I remember when you first started talking about this concept of universities. So unpack that a little bit for our audience.
Yeah, sure. So this notion of universities is built on the reality that right before our eyes, colleges and universities have become the largest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in not just college towns like Gainesville or Madison, but also major cities. So this happened right before our eyes. And this new set of financial and political arrangements has created a dynamic whereby higher education has gained a growing power to control not just economic development, but political governance in ways that we probably have never imagined. And so that's the premise of this notion of universities.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Because on the one hand, you lay out the realities, right? And if I can remember, you went to NYU for grad school. I can remember what a grad school experience is, even the experience of being a faculty. And we take for granted our needs for Starbucks and the right kind of restaurants and gyms and all those kind of accoutrements that come with being faculty.
Right.
And that we like to be able to participate in because we are faculty, but we often don't think about the reality of how these places get to be these places in these spaces, right? And who gets displaced and what types of businesses get displaced. So talk a little bit about your traveling through this process, right? And it's interesting, right? Because you write about Trinity College, right? Which you've been at now for more than a decade.
Yep.
You write about NYU, which is where you got your graduate degree. Yep. Talk about what it was like for you trying to work through the thesis of this project at the same time, participating in the conditions that this process has created.
Wow, I'm glad you asked that question. So when I first began this book material, it was in 2003, as you said, quite some time. I was at the University of Chicago's Regenstein Library conducting archival, more historical work, research. I come out of the library and history unfolding hits me right in the face. There's a protest where individuals are saying, stop stealing the Checkerboard Lounge. They're charging you Chicago with cultural theft, cultural piracy. And being an academic, what do? I follow the crowd to the protest at the administration building. I begin to ask questions. They're saying, yes, this one act of, as you said, creating the amenities, the accoutrements to attract researchers and students and their families to come to UChicago in the midst of the quote unquote hood, that we, for years we turned inward. And now we're branching out. We know that people want an urban experience. So part of that is we see what's going on. The Checkerboard Lounge, Brownsville, great. So in the name of historic preservation, we're going to buy this lounge and relocate it into our commercial district that we're trying to ramp up to bring people, to attract people to come here and stay. And so as I began to investigate this, I'm like, okay. People are like, this is not just about the commercial piece. This is about the employment piece. So it's not just faculty that get employed in these schools. It's the low wage, primarily women of color who work in the cafeterias and on grounds and as an administrative assistants. It's that. And it's also the healthcare apparatus in terms of working there, but also being served there. And it's also the ramping up of police forces that are surrounding these areas to protect, to send a message of a safe brand. So on one side, I get the question, how can you bite the hand that feeds you? But I say, if you were working on a factory line and you saw unjust conditions, wouldn't you organize? Wouldn't you want things to be better? So there's that. But even on a deeper level, for me as an academic, this is exactly what we claim to be doing. That higher education, part of its value in the world is solving the most difficult problems that the world faces. So therefore, it would seem paradoxical for me not to turn my attention to the very problems in my own backyard. So from the outside, because we perceive higher ed to offer this public good, it seems preposterous that I would say that it's not doing that. That it's actually using its public good bennies, its public good ethos to actually extract wealth from the neighborhood surrounding it. But on a higher level, it's my academic duty to investigate these so-called contradictions. So that's how I answer those questions.
Yeah, one of the things the book highlights is the invisible hand of the university, right? You talk about the shooting in Hartford and the fact that it's a Yale police officer who's involved.
New Haven,
shooting, right? Right, and New Haven, excuse me, right? Trinity is Hartford,
right.
New Haven,
but it could be Chicago, New York, or Cincinnati. But keep going.
And the obvious response to folks is, why is a campus police officer policing so far away from the campus, right?
Newly released body camera video gives a dramatic new view from one of the two police officers who shot at a car near Yale University in Connecticut. The footage shows the officer firing several shots at the car last week. A woman in the passenger seat was injured. She and the driver did not appear to be armed. Both officers involved in the shooting are on administrative leave.
But the other part of the dynamic is that very often universities will protect themselves around the periphery in terms of buying real estate and other properties, but no one knows it's actually the university owned.
Yeah,
right. So in the campus police officer's mind, right, he might in fact be protecting university turf, even though it doesn't necessarily look that way. So can you talk a little bit about the real estate piece, which to me is really so fascinating, right? Because, as faculty, again, and NYU is a great example, right? How do you teach at someplace like NYU, right, and live in Greenwich Village, right, without a subsidy from the university or university housing in order to do that successfully? How do you teach and live at someplace like Columbia, right, without having that kind of support from the university? But at the same time, right, interest rates, mortgage rates goes up, right? Yep. Working class and middle class folks, right, lower middle class folks who work in these neighborhoods get priced out. How pervasive, right? So how pervasive, is our university's hands in terms of the real estate dynamic of some of these urban spaces?
Well, as I said from the beginning, at the beginning of our conversation, we tend to not acknowledge that colleges and universities are the biggest landholders in cities. So NYU and Columbia are two of the largest landholders on the island of Manhattan outside of the Catholic Church. Right? I just found out.
That's deep.
That's deep. Yeah. Duke University is one of the largest landholders in the county, just to bring it back home. Right. So USC in LA County, one of the biggest landholders and employers. So to get to your point about real estate, it's critical because on a basic level, I don't frown at the fact that on a campus, you can have property ownership that tends to buildings, laboratories, faculty housing, cafeterias, etc. That's fine. But as we have shifted to what I'm identifying as the knowledge economy, as the most dominant form of accruing and extracting and managing capital and labor in our political economy, things get kind of fishy. Because what's happened in the knowledge economy is that university laboratories and their knowledge and their innovation districts and their knowledge communities, these outpost developments that we see happening around and beyond the main campuses, they are driving a political economy that is shaped by taking academic research and using it to create profitable goods and royalties in a range of fields, from pharmaceuticals and software to police or military defense weaponry to big data, police contracts. And so as this has become the dominant economy in the US and particularly in our cities, universities are expanding their physical footprint to house this. And as they're competing with other cities and other universities for the top researchers. And of course, if the researchers want to be happy, their families and their children have to be happy. So then you have to create these faux urban experiences of combinations, retail, nightlife, recreation in these
quality schools.
What you say?
Quality schools.
Quality schools,
right,
secondary schools,
right.
Hospitals, to attract and retain the best and brightest. So what's happening is that these cities are being converted with the help of city officials. These cities are being converted into campuses because the cities understand that when people want to come back into cities, what they're imagining in their mind as an urban experience is a campus. Fully wired, Starbucks, museums, lectures, density, but safe and pretty homogeneous in terms of who's there. And so that's a campus. And so as this is happening and these footprints are entering into what former mayor of New Haven, Tony Hart, called a property tax gray area, because the presumption is that every property held by a university is being owned and utilized for educational purposes. But a lot of this new footprint, this new real estate, is for profit intentions. Right. So what happens is that this real estate serves as a property tax shelter. And this is not just private schools like Yale or Princeton, it's also public schools like Arizona State University and the University of Virginia. They found that, okay, so the state is giving us less money, we got to figure out different ways to get money. We sit on state land. What we can do is not only, hide under the educational status, but we can lease out our land to private industry. They can put their properties here, they can take advantage of our tax shelter, and then they can pass a lower fee on to us, and we can do what we want to with it without the scrutiny of the State House. So in Arizona State did that, and they were able to bring in Herm Edwards, the former football coach of the New York Jets, with his big salary, bring him in to coach the Arizona State football team and build a stadium without having to run it at all through the State House, right? The biggest development in the state of Arizona, a regional headquarters for State Farm Insurance, sits on ASU land and it's tax exempt. Talk about space age pimping, right? This is the process. This is the reality. These universities provide, and then as you mentioned, because they are raising the property values with these new developments, the primarily working class and people of color that live in the areas, their property taxes go up If they own, or if they're in rental properties, the price of housing goes up because universities are trying to, because they're so attractive, landlords are trying to retrofit single family homes into student housing, where they can pack 5 or 6 students into a 2-bedroom and break it up with Asian blinds or other kinds of partitions. So housing values go up. And then because the university doesn't pay property taxes, they don't put in on trash removal, snow removal. Think about Texas. They don't contribute to the maintenance of the electrical grid. They don't help pay for the secondary schools that their kids end up going to.
Right.
So this becomes a cycle whereby the very thing that we celebrate these new schools for, their prosperity, a major component of the prosperity is extracted from the wealth and the property values and the needs of the cities that they occupy.
Yeah. You describe, when talking about Columbia and NYU, you describe them as quasi-autonomous republics. And I was struck by that, right? And you just kind of laid that out. But you go to an earlier moment in these university development, and particularly the idea of eminent domain, that they could go in and buy up private property and then claim it for the university. And you talk about the role that race, and particular Blackness, plays in deciding what blighted areas are, right? So Blackness itself is equated to being blight.
That's
so
right.
Let's talk a little bit about eminent domain and the relationship to Black bodies in particular, and this idea of blight.
Yeah. So the story of eminent domain, as you mentioned, it goes back to the 1950s and 60s, and then it gets picked up again in the 90s and 2000s, especially when it comes to universities. And the important point about this is that the whole notion of blight, in order for a state entity, in the early version of eminent domain, it had to be a state entity that took control of private property. The area had to be demonstrably understood as blighted, meaning that it was in such poor conditions that it could infect, because it's a plant metaphor. It could infect the ecosystem of other parts of the neighborhood. So because it's blighted, it's a public good to come in, for the state to come in to buy the property at market rate. And then at the early period of eminent domain, that property had to be used for a public use. So a bridge, a road, a school, a museum, hospital, something of that nature. That was the early version. And in this early period, what happened in 1959 is that the Housing Act of 1949 got an amendment because a bunch of urban universities got together and lobbied the government to say that we're under duress by all these Black and brown folks coming into the city during the urban crisis. We need help, protection. So they made a alteration to the Housing Act that then allowed for any urban renewal project that was affiliated with the university to get $2 for every $1 contributed by the city. So cities lined up to put the university as the friendly face of the urban renewal projects. What happened here was that in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in New York, whole blocks of middle class, in some cases, middle class Black neighborhoods were demolished and made way for either an expanded campus or just kept empty to provide a perimeter around the campus so that Black presence wouldn't lower the property values. So again, in this earlier period, it had to be for public use. But then we get to the 2000s with Columbia, as you mentioned, in New York. And in 2004, there's a new case called Kelo versus the City of New London.
We fought for 9 long years. And unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against us, which I was really shocked. They basically just stripped everybody's property rights away from them. Eminent domain is supposed to be used for your typical, to build a school, a reservoir, a police department, to widen the roads, but not for economic development. Now they're saying they could take your property if someone could generate more property taxes than you. Is that right?
Wherever we go, we would be fortunate to ever find people like the people that were here in our lives again. Truly good people.
in this case, the argument is made that no longer does eminent domain have to be for public use. It can be just for public good. What that meant is that you could seize properties and it could be for the public good as long as it raised the property values of the area, as long as it created jobs, as long as it revitalized the neighborhood. That was good enough. So you know where I'm going. It could do these things and the current residents could be pushed out. And so the public good becomes the university affiliates that come in. So as long as it benefits somebody. So that case happened in 2004. In 2005, Columbia swooped in and said, okay, we want 14 acres of West Harlem to build a new Manhattanville campus. Local residents said, fine, we want you, come. But let's mix it up. Let's have a university building here, affordable housing here, a factory here, a workshop here. Columbia said, nah, we don't want it. We want it all for ourselves. We want it to be a campus. So they started putting money in to state agencies, start saying, we on the background. This was discovered by student and community journalists. They found out that the university was putting money into state agencies saying, we will underwrite your investigation of blight in the neighborhood. So talk about like straight up collusion.
Right, yeah.
Right? Saying that we will underwrite the investigation that will allow us to designate the area as blight so that we can come in and use eminent domain for our own purposes of building a campus. An early court judge said that the university's use of eminent domain in this case was mere sophistry. But because of the tight bedfellows between university leaders, state officials, and city leaders, the upper court said because of Kelo, this is totally justifiable. It will bring a public good because on this campus, they will make scientific discoveries and they will make technological innovations. And we know in the pandemic what that means. Moderna and Pfizer will use this research for free, kick back some royalties to the university, and then the community will never see the money. It will become a private money hustle. All in the name of the public good with federally subsidized research and development for private companies in big pharma.
You know, the way that you just described the situation with Columbia, your conversation with Henry Louis Taylor, at the University of Buffalo. And it's wild for me reading this because, I was at the University of Buffalo with Henry Taylor.
Wow.
Right. And maybe had two conversations with him the whole time I was there. Right. But when he describes how, really conversations about engagement with Black folks, right, in the community is just the shit on top. Right. And the real stuff is this kind of stuff that goes on in other places. I mean, that's exactly what you just lay out in Columbia, right? That there's a surface conversation that engages us on some level, but there's a back end that folks never have access to what's really going down and what the motivations are in these institutions, right? In these moments.
That's right. So so we talk, even in current austerity conversations about budget cuts and austerity, we're talking about one sliver of the budget. Right? The relationship between what we consider universities to do. They offer the service of classes in exchange for tuition. But in the new knowledge economy, that's just one fraction of what universities do. We aren't talking about the real estate office. We aren't talking about the technology transfer department. We aren't talking about the athletic budget, Duke, right? We aren't talking about the foundation. We aren't talking about the police budget. And that's where the money is really made. So the story with Henry Taylor is amazing because he talks about, and his good colleague at UPenn, Ira Harkeby, also they talk about the fact that, okay, we're putting out these great memos about urban engagement, outreach, etc. But when the real estate office hears that, they're like, yeah, we're doing urban engagement too. But what we mean is we're land banking. We're banking the land in Poland land in preparation for that internationally known researcher to come in. They want to turn the land we held, right, as blighted, and turn it into a laboratory for him to stay or her to stay. When we say urban engagement, yeah, we're building a Trader Joe's or a cinema or housing, but it's at price points that sit above the means of the current residents. Right. So yeah, we're engaging in urban engagement, right? We're downtown, my school, urban engagement. We're downtown building a downtown campus. What that means is putting our students in conversation with the financial industry and the State House for internships, right? So that's what we mean. So just because we're downtown, it becomes urban engagement. But our interests are about meeting the needs of our students under the cover of educational purposes.
You know, it's interesting how these dynamics even impact, you know, what we name communities, right? You know, so I'm reading the book and you're talking about Manhattanville, and I'm like, where the hell is Manhattanville, right? And I pull it up on the map and I'm like,
that's what's Harlem.
I grew up in New York. That's Harlem, right?
Right.
You know, what the hell is this Manhattanville thing?
Right.
What's West Harlem, right? It's like, what is this?
I'd like to introduce the new campus for Columbia in Manhattanville in West Harlem. This is 17 acres and 7 million square feet of new space for the university that will unfold over the next several decades.
No, it's a great point. And to be fair, Manhattanville was a term that was used to describe that area back in the late 1800s when that was a factory area. But university officials and city officials that working together to revive this area as a campus, revitalize that name of Manhattanville as a way to rebrand it as safe for students, researchers, and investors. So that's definitely the case. And we see this in many parts of the country. In today, South Central is now called South LA, right? For USC. So this story is national. It's happening all over the place.
The South Bronx is Sobro and all that kind of mess.
Yeah.
So you know, we're sitting here, at least I'm sitting here in Durham now, right? And one of the big town and gown issues of the last few years was the attempt to create light rail here, you know, in Durham, and for lots of reasons. In order to get federal money, they had to get buy-in from 2 of the 3 municipalities around. So, you know, it crazily went through Chapel Hill, but ultimately it fell apart because Duke pulled out, right? And Duke has been trying to negotiate all kinds of public, you know, pushback against them for basically killing light rail.
Say for myself, the tremendous disappointment that is the appropriate feeling for this moment. I don't think I could overstate that. We're taking a huge hit. We're giving up $1.25 billion in federal funding by not moving forward with this. But there isn't a path forward. Our problems with Duke have been tremendous.
And it makes me wonder, like in a city like Durham, which is historically Black, right? And even now, 45% of the population is Black. And raising questions about what does equity really look like for some of these institutions, right? You know, I had shouted you out on Twitter a few days before this interview, and we're having this reckoning moment, you know, as all these cities and universities are now, right? And Duke is trying to figure out, you know, we'll create this program, this kind of opportunity, right? And they're saying this to Durham residents, right? But Duke is also the largest private employer in the city and in the state, right? So they're not just talking to residents, they're talking to their employees, right? And their employees are saying, reckoning starts with you paying us a better wage.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Right. And what's often oblivious to, quote unquote, the employees, right, you know, and the laborers is to the extent that, well, the rent that you're paying for this home, right, mortgage you're paying, or, you know, or to this apartment, you're likely also paying to the same institution that underpays you. So in the context of this, right, and of course the law enforcement piece is always there within that context, you know, in the context of over policing and all those kinds of things.
Laying the table for development.
Right. And so in the context of this maelstrom, right, what can equity actually look like, right, as a true partnership between folks who live in these cities and the university?
Well, look, I'm glad you asked that question, because we think when I raise this issue and offer these critiques, people are like, oh, you're being so idealistic and critical. What are the solutions? What can we do? It's timely to talk on Left of Black about the Black legacy of what not only we can do, but what has been done. So when we look at something like the history of African-American and Latinx residents in these cities, and particularly not research universities, but community colleges and city colleges, we've got to go to places like North Oakland and Merritt College. So in 1960s, Merritt College became an extension of the North Oakland community, where they had teach-ins and speaker series and trips to Cuba and cafeteria sit-ins and conversations. This set the table in 1966 for what became the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Go ahead 2 years. Crane Junior College of Chicago becomes Malcolm X Community College. So when the students take over, what do? They create a prison annex so that incarcerated residents can get an education. This is 68, right? They, most notably as well, they fire the off-duty Chicago police officers that are policing their campus, and they hire an unarmed Black security company to do public safety. Then you go forward to your hometown in 1969, and already city schools are free. But Black and Latinx students and their white allies realize that the schools need to be responsible not just for free tuition, but the public schools are doing such a horrible job that residents aren't even prepared to go to college. So it shouldn't only simply be free tuition, it should be open admissions with the supports that make the school viable so residents can be prepared for the workforce that is increasingly becoming information and service-based. So these are things that have already happened. But during the pandemic, we saw the insecurities and the gaps that could be filled by a more robust vision of repair. During the pandemic, the University of Chicago began to package up unused food and began to distribute it to families in need. Why couldn't that be all the time? Yale got embarrassed when University of New Haven began to take its empty dorms and house essential workers who didn't want to go to their homes and infect their families with the COVID. Why couldn't housing on campus be made available all the time? And I saw this when I went to the University of Winnipeg, when their demographics changed with their campus because of protests on the part of residents saying, you turned your backs on the campus, on the city for decades. What are you going to do? And to their credit, they started trying to do things differently. So they built housing. The university built housing that included both residents and campus affiliates that was at price points from premium rate that paid for affordable rate and rate geared to income. They kicked out one of the food service multinationals, Tedesco, Marriott, you can fill in the blank, you know them all. Right? And created their own diversity foods that employed 65% of their workers from marginalized communities. They're trying to profit share, right? They also get their supplies for their food from a 65% of their supplies come from local farms within a 100-kilometer radius. They convert their cooking oil into biodiesel. So that's some things. But in terms of just campus expanding into communities of color, we've talked about pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. It's not the solution, it's a start. So right now at the State House in my home state of Massachusetts, Boston has had a voluntary project where they asked, because you can't make them, they asked schools to offer 25% of what you would normally have to pay if your property was accurately assessed. None of the schools offer 25%, not even 25%. So right now, the State House has a bill going through the State House that will make at least that 25% mandatory. So that's something that can be done. But again, it's a small thing. You can also enact community benefits agreements. So if you're going to be in our cities and expand in our communities, you have to offer some community benefits. So zip code specific job training projects. Right now you have some of this, but it's only relevant for construction work. It doesn't include Black and brown professionals because they don't want Black and brown professionals competing with the very students they're trying to produce in the same market. So you got to keep aware of that. Right. It can include schools. It can include community centers. At Winnipeg, they have a community charter whereby a third of the essential hours that are used at the recreational facility have to be guaranteed for the community. And it's governed by a community board, right? Speaking of sports, you saw during the March Madness, we know that $900 million is made in 1 month during March Madness. Yet the students nor their fans received any of the money because of under the name of amateurism. So the educational purposes is a shelter. Amateurism is another economic shelter. And these stadiums sit in communities and they're also tax exempt. So what would it mean to say that a portion of that $900 million goes to these athletes and the communities that produce them? So these are things that can be happening. These are things that can happen. These are things that are real, they're material. So when I say DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about building an anti-racist university. We talk about diversifying the administration, diversifying the curriculum, diversifying the faculty.
Right.
These are the things that I mean when I say DEI, that we will never reach an anti-racist DEI moment until these schools repair the Black and brown neighborhoods upon which they build their wealth on a consistent basis and not a one-time gift a la Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, right? This kind of feudal philanthropy by the goodness of the heart of the school. No, we want a democratic governing arrangement whereby you understand a long-term partnership, fully recognizing that your wealth comes from our lack. That's what we need.
Right. I want to shift quickly before we close this to the COVID moment. I was in on a conversation that included some board of trustee members here at Duke, and a conversation came up about, the role that the institution has in this moment of COVID, right? And of course, this is when folks are first hearing information about, the way that Black and brown communities were at risk, because of hypertension and a range of other things. And one of the things that came out of this conversation, one of the trustee members suggested that, well, perhaps we might, for lack of a better way to describe it, build fat farms, right? Where Black folks could go to get exercise.
Whoa.
And I would tell you, there were a bunch of looks of folks on that Zoom call that responded that same way. That being said, though, right, universities were in this weird moment in COVID, right, particularly as they were trying to open up, right? And so I'm looking at Durham and it's like, we're going to bring all the students back in. Okay, but you bring all the students back to town, you put people who live here at risk, right? So what is the responsibility then the university does have in terms of COVID testing, right? In terms of vaccination, right? And we could extend this to things like the flu, flu vaccine. So what have you been able to gather, as the book has come out over this last year about the role that some of these institutions have played specifically addressing the COVID crisis?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, during the beginning of the crisis, the University of New Haven and then Yale followed, offering beds to essential workers so they wouldn't affect their families. But the healthcare nexus is critical because these medical centers and university hospitals are also tax exempt, but it's under the condition of providing indigent care. So not just vaccinations, basic primary healthcare. But because of the profit orientation of these institutions, they're shifting away from community hospitals and clinics and moving towards profit-oriented discovery and research around cancer research and discovery, and even plastic surgery as a way to generate revenue. And so they're not telling these communities that they have an obligation to offer indigent care in replacement or in exchange for their tax exemption. So number one, that whole nexus must be made more visible. They should be actually offering primary care at an affordable cost in exchange for the tax exemption off the rip, right? But in the pandemic moment, they should be offering testing to communities where they sit. They should be offering vaccinations for free to the communities where they sit. I don't mean offering your insurance card where you're gonna get higher premiums. I mean free vaccinations, right? Instead, what they're doing is that places like Johns Hopkins and Yale New Haven, what they've been doing is they have been seizing on these communities that are poor and of color for their for being for not paying their hospital bills. They're putting liens on homes, right? They're garnishing checks. That's what they're doing, right? So that whole financial arrangement needs to a drastic shift. First of all, but on a basic level, they should be providing, if they're going to maintain tax exempt status for indigent care, then they should be providing indigent care by ramping up community hospitals and health clinics and other kinds of things. In terms of policing as well, When I talked to Mary Washington, a senator in Maryland, she said, okay, there's all this discussion about defunding the police and shifting what's become a bloated redirection of social service money to policing, shifting it back to social services so that the first point of contact is not an armed response, it's a public health or a trauma-based response or a wellness response. What better location to model that kind of arrangement than a university with its medical facility? You could send out an army of healthcare professionals or those in professionals in training to do that kind of work in campus communities before you send an armed response.
Right.
That's the kind of thing, those are the kind of things that we could be doing, that we should be doing. But we hide behind the presumption that, oh, a university is a schoolhouse. For the last 20 years, teaching is one of the smallest things that universities are doing. Right. It's the smallest fraction of what they're doing. It's all these other things in real estate, in healthcare, and in policing, and their endowments that remain tax exempt. Yet they spend more money on the money manager than they do on community-based outreach with their endowments. And over the pandemic, you had schools, for example, like Columbia, its endowment increased by $300 million because they were sitting on the money on Wall Street, and they got CARES Act money. Right. And yet they're claiming austerity. And because of austerity, we got to cut budget lines. We got to fire people. What a hustle. Yeah. But again, I want to end. Please understand, I'm saying these things because there is another way. When I traveled all over North America, talking to people and seeing both historic and contemporary campaigns, we can enact pilots. We can enact community benefits agreements. We can defund the campus police. We can abolish campus police and put in unarmed units of public safety and care. We could, if anywhere, we can do that at universities, right? We can. Henry Louis Taylor, you mentioned, in the 80s, he was talking about turning universities into commons where everybody in the neighborhood can have a membership card to use facilities on campus. And administrators like, whoa, no, we might give city members a discount on a recreational card membership, but we can't do no common stuff. So the inheritance, our history shows a different path. This is not made up, pie in the sky, freedom dreaming. This is practical, on the ground, historical inheritance. We can do this.
We have been joined this afternoon by Professor Davarian Baldwin, the Paul E. Raether Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College. He's the author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, the Great Migration, and Black Urban Life, 2007, UNC Press, co-editor with Minka Makalani of the essay collection Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem, Minnesota, 2013, and the just published In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, which was published by Bold Type Books. As always, it is so enjoyable to talk to you, Davarian. I'm trying to find all kinds of reasons to get you to sit at the table with some of these decision makers here at Duke sometime soon, because this is such a critical conversation now. And Black faculty are in this interesting dynamic because there are ways in which, we're part of the solution at the same time that we're complicit in the realities that create this moment.
Right. No, listen, Mark, thank you so much for the space for all of us to come here and break bread with a master convener like yourself. And, the university is at the center of our economy, and it also can be at the center of transformation. And so I rest on being hopeful and optimistic, and it's all about possibility. And I think this conversation is a part of that. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Davarian.
Yeah. Peace.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything.